Good to see all of you tonight. We are going to wrap up chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians here in just a moment. We'll look at those questions real quick. I told you last Wednesday, I felt like we've spent more time in 1 Corinthians 15 than Paul spent in his missionary journeys. But anyway, we want to wrap up chapter 15, get into chapter 16, finish, I don't know whether we'll finish it tonight, but finish up discussing this book, and then we're going to move into 2 Corinthians after we complete this process. But if you would, if you have those question sheets, look at them real quick with me. 1 Corinthians chapter 15's questions. This is a review before we move into chapter 16. A belief in the gospel becomes vain if we do not do what? Hold fast. And what? Okay. What was the first information Paul had shared with them? It's a strange way to ask that. Yeah, the death, burial, and the resurrection of Jesus is what he came to them knowing first. Had there been any previous knowledge of the fact that Jesus would be buried and rise again? And so Jesus had given some prophecies in relationship to it, and again, that question may not have sunk in. List all those Paul said had seen Jesus after his resurrection. Okay, there was 500. Yeah, the 11, and then James, and then the apostles. He kind of talks about those various groupings. Why did Paul feel that he was the least of the apostles? Not part of that original group, and one born out of season, and the persecution of the church was partly of that as well. Did it matter who had been doing the preaching? No, the message was what was important, right? What had some been saying concerning the resurrection of Christ? Okay, or our resurrection isn't related to his, and that was kind of the conversation we had. If Christ is not risen, what does that do to the preaching of the gospel and to faith? It makes it vain, right? It makes it empty and vain if the resurrection's out of the picture. Is there any cleansing of sins if there's no resurrection? No, because we don't have all the truth. If we have a piece of the puzzle that's inaccurate, then we're still in our sins, Paul said in the narrative. What should make us miserable? Living in sin, or if all we have, Paul said, if all I have is in this life, then that's miserable. What two things came by man? Yeah, sin and death, right? Through Adam all die, and through Christ all can live, right? What is the last enemy Christ will destroy? That's death, right? And once all things are subdued, all authority will return to whom? Ultimately, through Christ to the Father. Would Paul do all things he is doing if there was no resurrection of the dead? He said, no, why would I do all these things and put my life in jeopardy and other issues? What warning does Paul give concerning evil communications? Yeah, it corrupts good habits. And we talked pretty extensively for a few minutes about how we need to make a contextual thought as it relates to that. Not just a generic one, which is fine, but we also need to understand that statement in the context in which it was said about those who were denying the resurrection in that message. I asked you a thought question. What does verse 33 have to do with the context of this passage? And we talked for about 10 minutes about that last week. What does Paul call the one who asked the question? What body shall we be raised in? Well, and why is that a foolish question? Now, not that I don't think he's being derogatory. Why is it a foolish question? And maybe I didn't drive this nail home enough last Wednesday, but it's foolish because it calls into question God's ability to give us a resurrected body. That's why it's foolish. On one side, we respect and honor the power of God to create us, to do all these other things, even to raise Jesus, but then all of a sudden we make an argument, well, he's not capable of giving me a resurrection. And that's why that statement would be considered foolish. Who will give us our resurrected body? God does. And what things is the resurrection of the dead sown in and raised in? Sown dishonor, raised in honor, sown corruptible, raised incorruptible in glory. What two images shall we bear? Okay. And in what manner will the change from physical to spiritual take place? In a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, the text says. And when will the prophecy, death is swallowed up in victory, be fulfilled? Okay, that mortal to immortal, and when that victory comes at Christ's return. Okay, and I realize that was speed questions, but we've talked so much about those various things. All right, give me a moment here. For some reason, I have lost all of my ability. Wow, that is odd. Oh, there they are. Okay, so chapter 16. It's interesting to note, and he kind of has this, what I would call kind of a leftover maybe question or issue to deal with in the first couple, 4 or 5 verses, and then he's just basically going into his conclusion after that. And so what's the subject matter at the very beginning of this chapter? Yeah, collection for the saints, right? And so again, there's been communication between Paul and Corinth. We don't have all the communication. That's made studying 1 Corinthians somewhat challenging because we don't have all the communication. We don't know everything that they asked. We don't know everything. All we know is Paul's responses to whatever it was they sent him. But I would take from this kind of statement now concerning the collection for the saints that they probably what? They probably asked him a question, right? You probably wouldn't say now concerning the collection for the saints if it hadn't already been a topic in some form or fashion. And so they most likely have asked some question as it relates to the collection for the saints, and Paul gives his response. Now, it's important for us to realize that at this stage, and again, Paul, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this when we get into chapter 16, but Paul's writing this on which of the journeys? I'm showing it to you, by the way. On the third one, right? He establishes the church of Corinth on the second missionary journey. This letter gets written while he's traveling on the third missionary journey. Again, I'll talk to you more about that before we're done this evening. But Paul, as he's going into these places, he'll even talk about the churches in Galatia, there's a problem where? In terms of need. Back in Jerusalem, back in Judea, right? This early conversation about the collection for the saints was very specific. There were things happening. Now, we've got other texts that talk about support of preachers. We've got other texts that talk about support of elders. We've got other texts that talk about the various things that churches were doing with their resources. But this text is very specific to what can we do concerning the collection necessary for the saints, and in particular, it was going to go to Jerusalem. We know that because that's what basically Paul's going to tell them here in just a moment. He says, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. So Paul says there's a consistency here. I'm not telling you something different that I didn't tell somebody else. I'm teaching everybody and sharing with everybody the same thing. That upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store, as God hath prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. You know, sometimes we overcomplicate things like the church treasury, we refer to it as. But there's a very simplistic process here. Basically, Paul says, if you'll lay by and store upon the first day of the week, what won't we have to do later? Yeah, we won't have to gather it all together. That part will already be done. If you gather it together upon the first day of the week, we won't have to walk around your homes when I get there, figuring out how we're going to get it collected and taken from Corinth to Jerusalem where it's needed. There's a very just simplistic, practical purposing that Paul has as it relates to the collection for the saints. He prescribes it upon the first day of the week. What's practical about that? They were already meeting. They were already assembling, right? Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, when Paul's traveling on his third missionary journey, he ends up going through a place called Troas, if you recall. And what happens? That's where he preaches late and all those things occur in those issues. So very practical. Go ahead, Ed.
Another thing, too, that was a Gentile church sending to Jewish Christians.
Yeah.
So, there's another thing there.
Yeah. There may have been some Jewish portions, but they're in a Gentile world. And it is interesting that they're sending back to most likely the largest benefactors would be Jewish descent Christians. So there's a couple of just quick things that I think we need to focus on. So we know the collection was a consistent message. I didn't emphasize it and probably should have, but he said it was for whom? For the saints. Quick question, would you consider that limited or unlimited? Yeah. When you specify, when you say, what I'm telling you to do is for the saints, that makes that action limited. Okay. It has a particular audience of people in mind. Now, were there other things that may come up in other times and other purposes? Instructions Paul gives in different moments to individuals and how we're supposed to act and behave towards those who are in need. Sure, there are lots of other conversations. But this conversation happening here in 1 Corinthians chapter 16 has a limited purpose. Now concerning the collection for the saints, Paul specifies what the purpose of the collection was for. Go ahead, Gary. Yeah, and you'll see that coming in the narrative. Go ahead, Jim. Well, at this moment in time, I'm going to argue that I'm going to stick with what Paul says. And there's a specific purpose and a specific function going on in this moment in time. What he's telling them is there is a specific need that is happening. Verse 3 tells us where it's going, right? When I come, whomsoever ye shall approve by your letters, and we'll talk about that before we're done, but them will I send to bring your liberality unto Jerusalem. So we know who it was for, and we know where it was going. What Paul is dealing with here in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, I would simply argue is, it can be principle-based in some senses, but he's got a very focused purpose. Who it's for, saints. Where? You're going to send it to Jerusalem. But there's a specific need that he's also trying to address. So when he talks to those in Corinth, he says, I'm going to tell you all the same things I told those in Galatia. There's a need among Christians back in Jerusalem. You all have the ability to help those Christians back there. This is how we're going to do it. In the early goings of the church, you have moments like that. What do you have during the days of Corinth that we don't have now? It's not a trick question. What is Paul? He's an apostle, okay? You're going to have various offices, functions. There are going to be ways that the church is learning how to function through various very specific needs arise. How are we going to deal with that? Back you up. Acts chapter 7, 6. When there was a need among the Grecian widows, they come to the apostles. We got this problem with the Grecian widows. You guys need to help us fix it. What did the apostles say? We should not stop preaching in order to serve tables. Look you out seven men in order to address this specific need of these Grecian widows. That structure didn't necessarily permanently stick, because later, as the churches grow in purpose and function and more locales begin to be established, then Paul begins to send men like Timothy and Titus out to establish churches under what kind of organization? An eldership with their deacons. And so there are going to be moments in the infancy of the church where specific things arise that need some sort of structure in order to handle. As they're trying to figure out, how do we do this? How do we help the church in Jerusalem, those saints in Jerusalem, with their problem? Paul says, here's how you're going to do it. Just like I told those in Galatia. Upon the first day of the week, you're going to lay by and store, so that there's already a storage of the things necessary to send to those brethren when the time comes. And then through the process of time, and you read other narratives and other passages, you see other things that churches were doing in terms of benevolence, in terms of helping with the spread of the gospel. In fact, even in this text, in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, Paul, and I'm way ahead, but Paul said, I hope to come and spend the winter in Corinth and hope then when I leave that you'll what? Yeah, and you'll, basically, and I think when we see the language, he basically says, I hope you'll pay the bill. I hope you'll finance the trip from here back to Jerusalem. And so right now he's talking about a specific need and how we're going to handle it. It doesn't mean that there aren't other functions that the churches were going to be given or purposes that their wealth and prosperity was going to be able to aid with. He just has a specific focus in mind at this particular time. Well, yes and no. I mean, we sometimes, if we used it by itself, Jim, for all the things that we do, then we might say, yeah, we're taking it out of context. We use it as part of a larger picture. It's one passage of many that address the issue. And we understand how the church should function and what roles it should fulfill and what roles it shouldn't. Where is it limited? Where is it not limited? You have to take the bulk of what the New Testament says on that subject in order to get the fullness of what we are doing now. Because, again, they're in the infancy of the church. This is brand new to them, right? I mean, you think about that. We've been having a collection upon the first day of the week all of our lives. Paul writes to them and says, can you imagine there was a first day of the week, which was for them the very first time they ever did this. And it hasn't happened yet because he's just now given them the instructions on how to do it. So I think in fairness to the text, we need to understand what Paul specifically has in mind. And then if we're talking about the whole of what the Lord's treasury, the church treasury, can be used for, then we have to look at all of the narrative of the New Testament in order to establish that and make sure that there's biblical authority behind the action and purpose. And that's an interesting connection too, Bob, I think that we should make, is on one side of the coin, and I'm not saying we would say this, but I suppose somebody in those days might wonder, why am I sending our prosperity back into Jerusalem? But yet those very same people back in Jerusalem were the earliest generous people among Christians. They were the ones selling homes and selling properties and bringing the proceeds before the apostles in order to aid and benefit all those extra people that stayed there after Pentecost. And so Jerusalem church knew generosity. They were just in need. That's where the famine is now and where the need arises. So Paul says, take care of this before I get there. And he gives them a structure by which to do it. And he says, when I come, whomsoever you shall approve by your letters, Then will I send to bring your liberality unto Jerusalem. Why do that? That's exactly right, Jim. Paul, even though he's an apostle, wants to leave no questions about whether the prosperity that's gathered there in Corinth actually makes it to Jerusalem. How do we do that? You pick them. Paul looks at them and says, you pick them. You decide who you believe is trustworthy, and you prepare them to be sent to Jerusalem in order to bring this liberality unto them, this aid and assistance that you're sending. You all pick them. And we'll send letters with them helping anyone that they come in contact with know that they've been approved for this purpose. And if possible, Paul says what in verse 4? I might go with him. He's not sure right now. He's not sure whether he'll be able to make that trip and whether they can go with him or whether there'll be two different trips or how that'll be. He's hopeful that he can make the trip. But at this stage, when he writes this letter, he's uncertain as to whether he'll be able to make that trip into Jerusalem. So it makes it even more important that they pick out some trustworthy individuals among the church there in Corinth that can handle this collection for the saints. It would be a vital aspect of how this could appropriately be done. And we know that eventually that occurs, and that assistance does arrive. Thoughts or questions through those first 4 verses about the collection for the saints? And I kind of purposely chose not to just chase that whole church treasury subject around, just because it's not really what Paul's dealing with here. He's dealing with a famine. They need help in Jerusalem. Here's how you can help them. That's kind of what's happening here. And rather than pull all the other contexts in and have that conversation, I just chose to stay with the narrative.
We can do the same thing today, can't we?
As far as
Helping out the
helping saints, absolutely. I think that this is a precedent for that. If we're going to talk about principles, then this would be a principled precedent of how a church can take from its collection and send it to help saints in some other location in order to accomplish that. Any other questions about that portion? So Paul says then, now I will come unto you when I shall pass through Macedonia, for I do pass through Macedonia. So here's where I wanted to pause, and let me share a couple things with you. So if you could see those lines on the screen, and I'll hold still here in just a second, I promise. The blue line that you see, and I'll shrink it back down so you can see the whole picture. If you can see the blue line, that was trip 1. The red line is trip 2. The purple line is trip 3. And the green line is actually when he ended up back in Rome. And the events that circle. So here's the point I want you to notice. So he writes this first letter to those in Corinth, as we said earlier, on his 3rd missionary journey. The second trip, basically, if you go into Acts chapter 18 and you look at verses 1 through 17, you'll start to see the wrap up of the second missionary journey. In fact, the second missionary journey ends Acts 18 verse 22. That's where that second missionary journey, red line. So he makes his trip and he ends up, Corinth is over there in that green. Let me just walk up there. So here's Corinth, okay? There's Corinth. That's Macedonia that yellow blob up there at the top. And so Paul says, I need to make this trip. And he's already, the second journey, the red line, he ends up going through Corinth. That's when the church gets established. Then the purple line, it's really kind of hard to read. I should have just gotten rid of all those but the one. But when Paul writes this, I'm trying to show you enough of it, but make it large enough for you can see it. He's in Ephesus. Okay? When he writes this letter, he is in Ephesus. We kind of know this is the third trip because in Acts chapter 18 and in verse 17, they encounter a guy by the name of Sosthenes. Sosthenes, in verse 17 of Acts chapter 18, is a chief ruler in the synagogue, and they kind of drag him into the problems there, and we are introduced to him there on that second missionary journey. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 1, same guy is with Paul when he writes this letter. So you encounter him on the second trip, and he's with Paul on this third trip when he writes it. So, Ephesus, all the way over here. So, Paul's going to have to make his trek from Ephesus all the way up in to Macedonia. That's the whole region, by the way. Macedonia isn't a place on the map. Macedonia is a region on the map. Before he'll make his trek down through by water and come up around back into Corinth. And so and I share all that with you to get you to help us see that's why Paul doesn't know whether he's going to make it there in time to be able to go to Jerusalem with them or not. I'm hoping to get to Corinth, but I'm not coming straight from Ephesus straight across the Aegean Sea and stopping in Corinth. I'm coming via Macedonia. I'm going north up into Macedonia first before I ever get down there. And so we can kind of understand why that would happen. So he'll travel through Macedonia before he arrives at Corinth. Like we said, he's presently, when he writes this, at Ephesus. Acts chapter 19, if you study Acts chapter 19, that's when he deals with all them silversmiths and all that trouble and chaos that ensues at Ephesus. So if you can imagine in your mind for a minute, all that trouble and stirring around that's happening in Ephesus in Acts chapter 19, while all that's going on, Paul's writing this letter. That's when he writes it. So he's writing this letter to Corinth all the while he's dealing with all that trouble that's going on over there in Ephesus in Acts chapter 19. But because there was a lot of benefit from the preaching there at Ephesus, Paul stays for quite a while. And so he says, I'm coming, but I'm coming via Macedonia. And it may be that I will abide, yea, and winter with you. Now here's what I mentioned to you earlier, that you may bring me on my journey whithersoever I go. I believe the implication of that language isn't just you ride shotgun with me. He's talking about, I'm hopeful that you all will have the wherewithal to financially send me on the remaining part of this journey that I'm on. And so he initially says, if I get there in time, maybe we'll just go along with the group you send to Jerusalem with your prosperity. If I don't, I plan to hopefully come there, maybe spend the winter with you. And after that, then you might be able to send me on wherever the next phase of his travels are. For I will not see you now by the way, but I trust to tarry a while with you if the Lord permits. So I'm not coming directly. I'm coming via some other areas. But hopefully, if I can get there, once I'm there, I'll spend some time with you. I'll stay through the winter. will spend some time being able to benefit. But for now, I'm staying where? Verse 8 says, but I will tarry at Ephesus. So there's how we know where he is. For now, I will stay at Ephesus, at least until Pentecost. And what's the reason for that? That he's going to stay. He says it in verse 9. Yeah, there's a great door of opportunity here. There's lots of opportunity to continue to present the gospel. Makes sense to stay. So long as there was benefit, the gospel was being heard, people were learning about salvation in Jesus, I'm going to stay here. But not only were there opportunities, though, there were what also? Yeah, lots of adversaries. Things that were challenging this process. I referenced to you, that's all what's going on in Acts chapter 19. And by the way, which is also where he encounters Apollos. Remember when earlier in 1 Corinthians when he said, some say I am of Cephas, I am of Apollos. And Paul's been dealing and addressing him, although he'll mention how he hopes he can come into Corinth again. But all those challenges that happened there in chapter 19, as it relates particularly, you've got those sons of Sceva that he deals with. That's happening while in this same time period he's writing to the church at Corinth. That's where you have that scene where that great confession, if you will, takes place, where they bring the books and they burn all those curious arts books in front of the pup. All that's going on in Ephesus. At the same time, Paul's dealing with all those issues in Corinth. Now, here, and you can keep going. There's a riot occurs. Those silversmiths, remember, they get all mad because everybody knows Ephesus is for the great goddess Diana. That's all happening. And I wanted to come back to that for a minute, because if you remember, Paul wrote and talked about all the challenges that he's encountering and all the difficulties that he encounters in order to continue to preach the gospel, and the weight of all the churches on him. So while he's dealing with this, he's also still trying to write and communicate and stay in touch with these other places. It's an amazing amount of weight and responsibility that the Apostle Paul feels as it relates to these various places that he had brought the gospel to. So there's a great opportunity in Ephesus. I'm going to stay here for a while longer, but there are a lot of adversaries. There are a lot of guys troubling and creating challenges for that. If Timothy comes, verse 10, see that he may be with you without fear, for he worketh the work of the Lord, as I also do, and let no man therefore despise him. Isn't that interesting? What did Paul tell Timothy when he sent him out? Let no man despise your youth. So he plants the seed in Timothy's mind when he sends him to places, let no man despise your youth. But Paul didn't just say that to Timothy, he says it to the places as well. Listen, when Timothy gets there, you may have reason in your mind just to kind of despise and turn aside. He's a young guy, why should we listen to him? Don't despise him because of his youth or any other reason. I'm hoping he can get there. It's kind of interesting because, again, you go back into Acts chapter 19, you'll find, in chapters 20 as well, that you'll see that Paul sent Timothy through Macedonia first. So it's almost like Timothy is going the path before Paul gets there. He sends him up into Macedonia. Then Paul comes into Macedonia. He's hoping Timothy will then make his trek down into Corinth. Then Paul will end up in Corinth eventually as well. And ultimately he's hopeful that they'll reconnect. But if he's able to get there, Paul says, then don't despise him. Let no man despise him, but conduct him forth in peace. Again, I think Paul was saying, I hope you'll send me along if I come and stay the winter. When Timothy gets there, I hope that you'll financially aid and help him as he continues to travel, that he may eventually come unto me, for I look for him with the brethren. As Paul just begins this process, if you will, of wrapping up this conversation with those in Corinth. I'll pause for a second, say thank you to those at home that have joined us tonight, and Lord willing, we'll be back at 10 o'clock on Sunday, and we'll be back, Lord willing, next Wednesday at 7 as well. And so we want to thank you for joining us, and we'll catch you again, hopefully, Lord.